This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite horror, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jeff C. Carter, and this week we're talking with Gordon B. White about his new collection, Gordon B. White is Creating Haunting Weird Horrors. Gordon is a Shirley Jackson and Bram Stoker Award-nominated writer of horror and weird fiction, including And In Her Smile, The World, with Rebecca J. Allred, Rookfield, and As Summer's Mask Slips and Other Disruptions. His stories have appeared in dozens of venues and best of lists, and his interviews and reviews can be found at genre outlets such as Nightmare, Hell Notes, and Lightspeed. Welcome to the show, Gordon.
Thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this, so it's good to be here.
Here's an icebreaker. Tell me your favorite Soulsborne game, and I'll tell you what it says about you.
Oh, I mean, I think it's the easy answer, but Bloodborne for sure.
Bloodborne.
Not even a question.
Okay. So that means, let me consult my list here, that you fear the old blood.
I do, actually, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, who likes old blood, really? But
I'm trying to think of a time I've seen old blood and been like, that's good to see.
That's appealing. What do you like about the Soulsborne games?
I really love the way that they approach storytelling. I mean, I think that if you like video games and you like Soulsborne games, like part of it comes from the challenge and the difficulty, the sense of accomplishment with beating it. But the other half comes from absorbing the storytelling through the environment that they have. And then, listening to people's various interpretations on YouTube lore videos. It's crazy when you think of the amount of narrative that is hidden in various bits and pieces. And a lot of times it gets very obtuse and you do sort of need a decoder ring to make sense of it. But it's actually changed how I write fiction a little bit in terms of some of my most recent experiments with different forms like second person and stuff. So I think it's really fascinating. It's obviously really well thought out in the way that there's so much there to dig into if you want. But that's also to the danger of lore, is that you can get very obsessed about minutia.
It's interesting how they will develop the lore, sometimes going back hundreds of years in the case of Elden Ring, and then they will deliberately go in and start cutting out information.
Yes, I love that.
What you're getting is vestigial bits and remnants of a world, and it's on you to make collections. And I think especially with short stories, that is such an important attitude to bring to it, rather than bloating a story by over-explaining everything, connecting every dot. So, Gordon, tell us a bit about yourself. Where'd you grow up?
So I grew up in the South. I grew up in North Carolina. Then I spent my college years and afterwards in New York City. And now I'm over in the Pacific Northwest. So I've been all around the country.
You've made a full circuit. You just need to get up to the northern Midwest.
It's true. Well, my grandma lived in Chicago, so I would go visit her. So I've been in that-ish area. But sure, there's large swaths of the country I had yet to spend decent amounts of time in.
What were some of the cartoons and books and toys that freaked you out when you were a kid?
Oh, man. I think everybody of a certain age, Are You Afraid of the Dark has a very central part. I think there's probably the starter pack for authors and creators of a certain age of scary stories to tell in the dark, and the illustrations in particular. And then Are You Afraid of the Dark on Nickelodeon. And then probably throw in some sort of weird traumatizing body horror like Ren and Stimpy or Rocko's Modern Life.
Did those early horror impressions lead you into horror?
I think what really led me the most into horror was my dad was a really great storyteller. He grew up in Eastern North Carolina, and he had just a whole wealth of ghost stories and allegedly true things that happened to people. So there's lots of family stories, which any good family story is a healthy mix of something that happened, something that may have happened, and then just a lot of bullshit that gets passed along. But he was a really great storyteller. He would tell us campfire stories when we went camping. He had all sorts of ghost stories that I later on found out a lot of what he did was he had read a lot of early American and British supernatural stories, and he would take those and then just set them in rural North Carolina and pretend they had happened to him. So one of the stories I remember the most is The Willows, which I later found out was a classic story.
Yeah,
but he had told me that it was him and his friend on a canoe going down one of the fucking little rivers in Wilson, North Carolina. So that sort of blending of things really stuck with me. And so when I decided I wanted to make a go of like writing fiction for people to read, I thought, what is the thing that's always resonated with me the most? And it was those kinds of stories, and that's horror-ish. And so, I think I've always bent towards that way. But that was like the one that inspired me to do it in a narrative form.
So let's talk about your new collection and the self-titled story, Gordon B. White is creating haunting weird horrors. I'd like to start off by saying that this particular story that opens the collection is extremely my shit. It is meta. It is partly composed of short bites of microfiction. It's playful, it's unsettling, and it made me put the book down because I just wanted to let it soak in. I was like, I don't want to like jump into the next story. Like that was so good. It was a complete meal. I just have to sit here with that. Let's talk about this first story.
Yeah. So from a high level, it's a second person story, which people hate, but I love because I love doing things you're not supposed to do. But it's a second person story about a you who signs up for the Patreon of renowned, semi-renowned horror and weird fiction author Gordon B. White. Part of that, the perk you sign up for is something called Postcards of Lesser-Known Haunted Houses, which every month a picture of a house and a little microfiction about a ghost or ghosts living in there comes to your house. And then things escalate because the ghosts don't necessarily stay in the houses they were originally in or on the postcards. And so the weirdness and the horror begins to accumulate around the unseen you in the story.
Second person POV plays a major role in this collection. I love second person. I haven't written a lot of it, but I enjoy it every time it pops up in a story. Your collection really inspired me to take a couple runs at it. So for that reason, I would like a deep dive on all of your thoughts on your approach to second person POV.
Yeah, I mean, I love this. This is something that I've come to really appreciate. Like, I've thought a lot about it more recently. I started off writing the Gordon B. White is creating haunting weird horrors in second person, in part just to be sort of cheeky and contrary. Like, so I put my name in it so much. That's why it's meta. It's why it uses the second person view. But I thought a lot about that because there is, I think, a visceral reaction that a lot of readers have when they're something in second person. And to me, like, I've been thinking about why that is. And I think it's because people don't like being told what to do or what to feel. And they especially don't like being told, you did this or you felt this. There's always a struggle, no matter what person or tense you're using, to sort of create an emotional effect or connection with readers. And one of the things I found really helpful is, I think it's Donald Moss' book, The Emotional Craft of Fiction, where sort of the takeaway is that you can't describe an emotion so well that somebody feels it. The only thing you can do is you can create situations and characters that the reader will feel for, will empathize with, and therefore have their own emotional reaction. So it's not necessarily the same thing that characters feel. They can overlap, they can be entirely different, but you're never going to describe like what it feels like to be scared so well that somebody is scared. It's not how emotions work. So I think that people, readers especially, like really buck and chafe, like if you tell them what they do or what they think. And it can work a little bit. I think with humor it works a little too, because people, they either need to pull back enough that they don't really see it as a you, they just understand you as a separate character. But if you want the reader to identify with it, I think it's really important to leave blank spaces. And so this like tied back to the Soulsborne video game, another second person story in the collection called Godhead, which is where you are assigned to infiltrate the enormous corpse of God in a valley. And I approached that by thinking about it like I think of like video games, especially like Bloodborne, but also things like Zelda. Anything where there's a silent protagonist who still interacts with other NPCs. Because if you think about it, there's times, or if you're Link, you'll go up to somebody and they'll be like, oh, take this sword, it's dangerous out there. And Link takes the sword. Those events are fixed, what the character says and what Link does. But it's sort of what you put into the middle as the player, like what emotional charge or view you bring. Because if somebody says, take this sword, and you go, yes, I will, I'm looking forward to this adventure. Link takes the sword, and somebody says, take this sword. You go, fuck no, man, you take that sword. And then you still have to take it anyway. The events are the same, but the emotion, the charge, the experience that you as a player are bringing are very different. You know, you can have the exact same events with the exact same dialogue and exact same narrative fights and puzzle. And if you yourself are the reluctant hero, it's very different than if you yourself are the venturesome hero. So when I wrote Gordon B. White's creating haunting weird horrors using second person, I tried not to push too much onto the readers. When I did say things like you felt or you did, they were humorous, so people could sort of like laugh and go along with, all right, that's okay. Like, I don't feel like you're opposing my personhood. You're not doing something contrary to what I would do. With Godhead, since it's a bit more surreal and a bit more not serious, but less like overtly playful, I wanted to very much like leave space in the blank for people to put their own feelings in. So while there is dialogue, all the dialogue from the you from the second person is implied. People will say things and then they'll respond to your answer. But I tried to leave those open ended so that any logical response the reader would have for their own self as it comes up would fit. I intentionally didn't put any you feel or you like emotional experience because I wanted to leave that for the reader. So there is in that one, there is sort of a sense of like inviting the person to play along. The reader has to come in and give it something in order to flesh it out. Because I think like the second person can be very intimate, but also people also find it the most distancing, and it's very weird. So it's something that's intriguing to play with.
In the follow-up story to Godhead, The Forever Home, it's also in second person. In this instance, you did layer in dialogue for the second person POV. As the collection goes, are you slowly getting people warmed up to the boiling water that is second person POV by first leaving a lot of space and a lot of distance and then drawing them in with more dialogue, more emotion, slightly less agency as the stories progress?
Not intentionally. I think it's just that's just how they fell.
Because October Vines has even less agency.
Oh God, I forgot about that. Yeah. It's interesting like how they come out in the things because in terms of timeline, Forever Home was written first, and that one is more sort of I think would be an ease into, and then October Vines, and then Creating Haunting Weird Horror, and then Godhead. So you can see, in a chronological order, they go from sort of easier to more obscure and more like esoteric in terms of how they approach second person. But you're right, it doesn't flow necessarily that way in the collection, which is interesting. Putting together a collection is such a weird thing. Like there's such a like it's so vibe based.
Yeah, I mean if you can make a mixtape, right?
Yeah, that's a very good thing. I always think that they need to flow together, but also too, I like to make like chunks. So there's like 3 or 4 chunks I feel like in a collection that don't necessarily have overt connections, but to me feel like if you were going to read a lot in one sitting, you could read 3 or 4 and then stop there and feel like you got a little journey. But if you went the whole way through or you retained it, you would have an even bigger one.
That's definitely present in this table of contents. I like to reference Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics when breaking down story. He has a very interesting take on avatars, characters that you insert into a story when you're drawing a graphic novel. The more detail you add to the character, the more concrete the character becomes, but also the more psychologically distant it becomes from the reader. Because if you don't look exactly like that character, you don't necessarily identify and embody that character. Some of the most famous characters are a little abstract. They're a little vague in their faces. It's that empty space you were talking about that allows you to pour yourself into the mold of the character and experience the story.
Yeah. I mean, that's always the struggle, I think. Like, I tend to write more sort of like, I guess, bigger, sort of definitely in terms of physical details, just because my visual imagination is not as great as other people's. Like right now, as we're recording this on Twitter, there's a meme circling around about how in detail you can visualize an apple, whether or not it's like, nothing, complete aphantasia on one end to the so vivid you can see, the dots in the skin on the other. And I'm definitely more towards the not so much, like very sketchy. And so I worry sometimes that I do leave too much space. So there's always the struggle of going back in and fleshing out the details. That's really interesting, especially with protagonists too. You always do sort of worry. Like, I mean, I think people get different interests. Like if you read very maximalists, like sorts of literature, like definitely like the old 1800s and early 1900s style of literature, which were basically movies because people didn't have movies, so they had to describe everything in great detail. It's a very different experience for me than reading something that's much more sort of impressionistic. I mean, but I would much rather, I love them both, but I would much rather read Dennis Johnson than Tolstoy again.
So the second story in this collection, one of the good ones, has the patter and rhythm of a joke. Cop walks into a bar.
Yeah.
But it also is structured like a joke. It ends with a punchline. How much of that was intentional?
Probably literally all of it. That one I very much. I definitely came up with the line "It's a gas" was the first one. That's sort of the subtitle. One of the good ones, or "It's a gas." It's all full of jokes. This one involves, a couple of cops who are trying out a chemical spray that turns the people who are hit with it into sort of mindless attackers. The sensible theory that they're going to use this to have protesters destroy each other and justify excessive force against them. But it comes from a thing called the box they have is "You Need a Munition Supply," which is a reference to the Return of the Living Dead, Night of the Living Dead 2. Whatever the second one is, the really funny one, because the place there, that "You Need a Medical Supply." So all of these sorts of like references in there. But once I like had that sort of jokey idea, I was like, I need to just putting like little bits and pieces of jokes I didn't think would fit well. So I was like, I'm going to have to expand this to the whole structure. And so it starts off, then a cop walked into a bar, which, is very, classic joke setup. And the punchline too, I think I had it be, as I went through, like I found the voice for that. That's one where I wrote the first like 2 or 3 paragraphs first and really like polished those in order to get a sense of what the voice was going to be. Like, what are the details? Like how, what's it looking at? Like how grotesque is this going to be? And then I found the repetition of the joke kept coming back up. And that I hadn't necessarily intended, but it felt right to go as I went through. And I started to see the ways that it could come up again together. And it's one of those like happy accidents. I think the most sort of the most fun to write, and hopefully the most fun to read, are the ones where there's an intent, behind certain elements, but then from there the artistic impulse takes over and guides you to something that feels right, that you wouldn't necessarily plot out if you'd come up with it ahead of time.
This story pairs very well with the first one in that it's got this rhythm to it with these little resets or breaks in the action that build. In the first one, it was receiving the postcards. In this one, it keeps going back to a cop walks into the bar. At one point, the narrator says, "Stop me if you've heard this one," before resetting. And there's an ironic twist. Yeah. In the very center of the story, some of the characters tell a joke to each other. It does feel very intentional. And I would say that one of the through lines in all your stories is this incredible intent that pairs the imagery and the similes and the metaphors up to the title and whatever the main conflict is. You find all these ways to tease it out with your word choice. It's very effective and very impressive. I'm surprised that there's so much room for discovery because it feels like these things are really dialed in.
Well, it's interesting. One of my things that I very much believe in is that the narrative voice is not the author's voice. And it's very important to me that each of the narrators, even if it's a third person narrator who never inserts themselves, is that they're a specific entity. Like they need to be, for me, they need to be a specific character that I can conceive of. And I need to know like who they are, what is their background, who are they telling this to, why are they telling this, and what do they think about it. So I never want to fall into like the writer voice where I'm just describing things from a dispassionate point of view, unless that's the intent that I'm going for. But so for me, it's really like something like, one of the good ones, like the person telling it, they have like a very specific point of view, like their metaphors and their imagery and the things they notice coalesce. I find like when I work with beginning writers, like one of the things that's the hardest is for them to realize that sort of paring down and focus. They like to bring in metaphors and vocabulary and words that they use. They don't hem in their influences. And as a result, I think that they also don't necessarily tap into the creativity that brings. Like so much creativity comes from constraint. And so by really focusing in on who your narrator is, what they view, you begin to find things that you yourself wouldn't find, as long as you're writing from that narrative point of view. You can have a very disdainful narrator, a very sympathetic narrator, even if you yourself don't feel that for the character. And as a result, you start to find unexpected things that develop and, you surprise yourself and hopefully surprise readers along the way.
So let's talk about What a Piece of Work. How would you describe that story?
So What a Piece of Work is sort of a reimagining of a final confrontation between Dr. Frankenstein and his creation.
It felt like a sequel to me.
That's when it started as a writing exercise, and then I like really connected with it, so expanded it out into the story that it is. But I think a lot of my stuff too ends up dealing with like father and son issues, so that becomes something really in there. One of the things is that the doctor, he never refers to him as the monster, he refers to him as the boy. And I think like the sorts of like the lenses and the words we give things are very important. And so I wanted to sort of reimagine that, and because in the end of Frankenstein, there's the they meet each other finally out on the tundra or whatever. It's been a while since I read it, but I wanted to sort of do something more intimate and also to give a chance at redemption for both of them.
This was a very touching story. It was one of the rare hopeful stories of a mended relationship in the collection. So much of the collection is about these broken, unhappy, unsuccessful, doomed relationships. Is it only because we are building on the entirety of Frankenstein with all the betrayal and murder and heartbreak that went on in their past that you can then shine a light on this redemption arc?
Maybe because I think one of the things that I can do with that is, and it's fairly short too, is that there is so much understanding that comes to people with this. There is the cultural understanding of sort of the journey of Frankenstein and his creation. There's lots of tropes, we have with mad scientists, and also to the dramatic confrontation between the avenging angel and the demon they're going to cast back to hell. I think tropes are incredibly useful as long as you use them intentionally. And one of the best uses for them is to do all this heavy lifting without having to devote narrative space to it. It starts off with Frankenstein kicking in the door to where the monster is hidden, and how he preparing his revenge for years and across the continents, and he's been driven by this. And then he meets this sort of pitiable sight. And I can bring people's emotional experience of that to bear just by using a couple of words when I play on those. And I think that's the most fun way, and probably the most fruitful way to use them, is to do that sort of heavy lifting.
Nice. So in your story, Fine and Fancy Arms, is that the kind of tale that your father would tell?
Yeah. So that one, I set myself the challenge of writing a story where it was all telling and no showing. I don't know that that's exactly how it came off, but that was the initial genesis. It was going to be all something told, not shown. So it is the narrator there is very much a presence. They refer to their past and where they've heard the story that they're relaying. I wrote that one when I had first started really thinking seriously about the narrator as a specific, separate person with a background, a vocabulary, a worldview, and a history. And so that was the test product. How with fashion, then they have the runway shows. There are all these outlandish things that aren't intended to be actually worn. They're just sort of
concept pieces.
Yeah, they're the concept of if you took this and knocked it up to 11, this is what it would look like. But we're gonna tone it down for what people really wear around. That one though is the stories I grew up with from my dad and from my relatives, except bumped up to 11 or 12.
It's the story about a relative who used to do water witching. He was a dowser, and he had dowsing rods, and he was famous for his ability to find water and lost objects. That reminded me that the last time I was on the East Coast over the summer, the water company was there. They were putting in pipes, they were looking for leaks, and they were using dowsing rods. And I was like, am I really, because I know what dowsing rods are.
Yeah.
Am I really seeing this? And not only am I not seeing it, a hippie who's walking around in the woods with crystals, waving sticks around trying to find water. This is like a salt of the earth, blue collar guy in a jumpsuit with his name on a patch, and he's got dowsing rods, and he's walking back and forth across the yard. I observed it, and then I did a little research. I went online, what's the deal with water companies and dowsing rods? And apparently this is a big problem. To this day, it is super widespread.
Yeah, well, I mean, my dad grew up in the late 40s and the 50s out in, rural North Carolina. And yeah, dowsing was the thing. They had to dig wells. And so, yeah, you get the dowser out there to look for the thing. And I think it's such a cool, weird way that there are pockets of places where things sort of hang on. And they're not necessarily weird there. I think so much of speculative fiction takes the lens of either we have a consensus reality of what is normal, and then something weird comes in, or the sort of everything's weird. Here's the story, sort of more fantastical era. But I think it's a really cool milieu to use where it's a world that we recognize as real with a speculative element that isn't strange to those people there. Of course, then you want to take it and create problems and conflicts with it. But I think it's a really fascinating thing to play with. And it's not that far from reality.
I mean, literally, a couple months ago, I was watching a guy douse who was a professional leak finder.
I love that. Oh man. Oh my, I'm gonna do a sequel to Final Fantasy Office and just call it like the nicest blue collar, and it'll be about a guy who's a professional leak finder.
Yeah, if anything, it's become normalized.
Yeah.
I was looking at these articles about it, and one of the links took me to the usgeological.gov website, and it was talking about hydrology and water flow, and they had a special section on water dowsing, and they're like, "There's no proof it works." But it's one way people understand water and its locations. It's like, damn, it's on a .gov. This is nuts.
Right.
Speaking of fantastical worlds and the mundane, I want to talk about A Song Like Laughter. This feels like a fairy tale. It's a story about a single mother in a trailer park struggling with her infant son when she gets a tap at the door and finds a giant magpie. Even though these are fairy tale events, it feels like you somehow really like desaturated it. You stripped all the gloss away from it and made it something that was very gritty and mundane, but not in like an urban fantasy, oh, my barista's an orc kind of way. It was like, oh, my drunk baby daddy is at the front door. Oh, no, wait, it's a giant crow. Did you choose to set it in a trailer park to balance out the fantasy symbolism of it?
I don't think intentionally. I knew people in trailers, and so it was just sort of a thing that came to me. And I think there's there is a fairy tale element there, but of course subverted in a not nice way towards the end. But I really like the idea of, again, like we've been saying with tropes. Like I think that they can be used very interestingly, because when you bring it up, people do the heavy lifting themselves. They know, like, what is this? They know what type of story this is, or they think they do, and then you change that. And you can start changing that by changing the setting, like putting in a trailer park instead of like a castle or a little cottage in the woods. You can then change it too by the sort of way you describe things, like how much attention you give to specific details, or how prose you use to describe them. And then as you sort of like destabilize people's understanding or their guess as to what's going to happen next, it just gets weirder and weirder. And I think that's just a lot of fun to do.
As a fan of fairy tales and also older fairy tales, I had an inkling of where that one was going to go.
Well, it's funny. When I was a kid, one of the things that, like all kids, I hated to go to bed. But my mom would let me, if I was like up too late and couldn't fall asleep, she would let me turn the light back on and then read until I fell asleep. But the only books she would like let me read is like old, very boring looking fairy tale books that are actually like just weird shit, like most old fairy tales. And so I would force myself to stay up. I would like pinch myself to stay awake until I go, Mom, I can't sleep. She's like, fine, turn on the light. Yes. And then I'd read until I fell asleep with these like weird ass fairy tales.
Yeah, that one turned out really well. Are there any other stories you want to focus on?
I do want to go back. So you mentioned Juniper Paul, which is a story about a woman and her fiance who go to her fiance's grandfather's cabin in the woods to clear it out after his untimely passing. And then there's a ghost that they encounter. That one, it's funny because we were talking about intent and how intentional things are. That one came like from a literal dream. The sort of horrible ghost thing at the center of that and what it does was a nightmare that I had. And I woke up and I wrote it down longhand like on like a couple pieces of paper beside my bed. And then I just sat with it for a while. I was like, what is this? And then as I thought about it more, like I began to see the context around it, and like how, there was sort of like a grief, and then there's like decisions that have to be made in terms of relationships and, taking care of other people versus taking care of yourself. So from that one, like pure weird imagination, where did this come from image, the rest of it I sort of like teased out into this longer piece that comes together. And so I just think like creativity is so weird, like how, in the end, like I can't tell when I look back, or I don't know that other people can tell when they look back, like which are the ones that I like plotted out and was like, I know what I'm going to do. I have a voice, I have structure, I'm going to do this, versus which are the ones that sort of grew up out of just experimental drives, just playing with things until structure found it.
The horror at the core of that story is genuinely nightmarish, really, really disturbing and unsettling. So I'm sorry for you that you had that hideous nightmare.
It It was, yeah, like and like basically, I don't want to spoil it too much because that one is something really weird in the middle. But the whole thing, the first encounter with the ghost, is directly from the dream I had. It's all like it was horrific, and then there was like more like sort of like wispy stuff around the edges, like the setting and some of the other things. But that was like directly from my nightmare, and I woke up. I was like, this has got to go into the to the book, or just got to go to a story. It wasn't a book at that point.
But the fact that you were able to tease out some of the elements of that nightmarish event and tie it into an emotional thread of codependency, it's so much of a piece. I am shocked that one came before the other. Anything else you want to tackle with this collection?
No, I think there's a lot of fun stuff in there if you have a certain point of view. The title story, Gordon B. White is creating haunting weird horror, has been translated into Spanish and has just been published for the third time in Chinese. So it's weird to me to think that people outside of my like little weird circle are enjoying it.
Do you have a Patreon?
I do not. I thought that would be a bridge too far, as if I did actually have a Patreon, because then it would be a bit too much to actually have one.
On the one hand, it would seem like self-serving. On the other hand, you're actually driving people away from subscribing to your Patreon by creating a horror story about that thing. Just real brief, but I wanted to sell a haunted doll. I wanted to write a better horror story about a haunted doll than I saw on eBay. Because it's just trash.
Yeah.
It's just a bunch of keywords stuffed together with some pictures of creepy dolls. And I was like, I can write a better horror story than that. So I bought a doll with the express purpose of selling a scary story. I had a little photo shoot with my doll, and I put it up on eBay, and I'd written that, it had been returned several times. And someone wanted to know, a potential buyer asked, why was it returned? And I said, oh, well, the last person who bought the doll got Bell's palsy and half their face was paralyzed. And they're like, yeah, I don't want this doll. But, I was keeping all my responses in universe, and it's a disservice to the long-term sales prospects.
Selling the doll.
Yeah. But I eventually did sell the doll. I did get a semi-pro rate for it.
Nice. That's one of those things AI will never take away from us, is haunted dolls. They might take our book covers, they might take our content, but they'll never take our haunted dolls or our ability to sell them on eBay. So.
Cut to Chat GPT/doll.
Right.
It just aggregates keywords in horror stories.
Assembling these little monstrosities.
Frankenstein dolls together and creating the most horrifying mixture of SEO and horror tales. Awesome. So do you have any fond Halloween memories?
When I was a kid, my dad would take out all the stops for Halloween. He was really big into making costumes, but in a really cool way. So he would make suits of armor and stuff out of paper mache for us, or we would get masks and he would build on top of them, or he would do bloody cut special effects makeups on our face, except to the point where we look like pizzas dripping down the street.
This is the time of the show when I usually ask authors about their local lore, but I did catch a reference in Fine and Fancy Arms to the Noonday Witch.
Yeah.
My latest obsession is Feldgeister, these horrifying Slavic and Germanic spirits that live out in the grain, out in the corn. Did your father ever discuss it, or was that just something you wanted to leave Dark Souls style as just a loose tag?
That one, I think I probably took from Gemma Files' experimental film. And part of her thing is the Noonday Witch, and I was like, well, I got fields, I might as well just pop a little Easter egg in there. I like to do that a lot. I don't have this idea of making a grand overarching mythology or tying things in necessarily to other stuff. But every once in a while, I'll use the same name for something with the intent of them being in at least a shared alternate universe, if not a real shared universe. Just because I think it's fun to do, and it's fun to read and it's fun to do.
For my listeners, in Slavic countries, there is a character called the Noonday Witch, sometimes referred to as Polodnitsa. She functioned as a boogeyman to keep people out of the fields at the hottest point of the day. So she basically acts like heat stroke. As part of her legend, she's got a giant frying pan, and she can either block out the sun and give people shade, or she can burn people, she can scorch the fields. she also scared children away from the crops because there was an issue of kids going in and trampling valuable crops or going into the fields to pick flowers and getting lost or getting overheated, things like that. So she was out there, she would catch people and ask them questions. If you tried to change the subject, she would cut off your head or she'd make you sick. She was also a three-faced goddess. Like the Norns, she could be a hag, she could be a beautiful woman, she could be a little girl. There's a lot bound up in this idea of the Noonday Witch, and Germany had their version, which is the Rye Mother, which listeners will be hearing me raving about for months to come. But we fixate on midnight, the witching hour, and the darkness so often, and you definitely don't want to be caught outside or you don't want to look under your bed, at the stroke of midnight. The idea that at its hottest and brightest, there's a particular witch that owns that time is so fun. It's like the 7 o'clock man in Canada. It's like, what? There's a boogeyman for 7 o'clock? I love it.
It's true though, but again, it's like those things, like taking those tropes, like everybody knows what a witch is, or like what a boogeyman is, but you put it where it doesn't belong, like out in the middle of the fields at noon, and it's awesome. Trip a little like bits like that, in your story and stuff. Even if you don't develop it, it sticks with people. I have this theory that stories that are too compact, that are too perfectly structured and neatly tied together, don't stick with people. They just go in one ear and out the other.
It's a solved equation. It equals out to zero.
Yeah. And so, but so I try to intentionally leave like spikes, like little spiky things, like either intentional, like questions that are raised and not answered. It's got to be intentional, or things like this, like references to outside mythologies and outside illusions, and just a little bit of like friction that keeps it from sliding out of their brain, I think.
And it makes it feel more real because in real life, not every question has an answer. There's so many unknowns. Yeah. And like you said, when something feels perfectly constructed, it must be a work of fiction, because nothing in life is easy and fully self-contained and satisfying, and it resolves, and the ending is a perfect mirror to the beginning and things like that. Where can people find you online?
Not on Patreon, but on literally every social media and on the web at Gordon B. White. So gordonbwhite.com for my website, at Gordon B. White for any of the social medias. Yeah, those are the ways to do it. Hit me up there and you can get in touch. I love talking horror and I love talking writing craft with people. I'm always thrilled to get a message and to respond back at great and rambling length.
Well, Gordon, thanks for chatting with us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast.
I guess it's the royal us. I don't know. Thanks for talking to me today.
You and the pumpkin.
Yeah. Please subscribe and follow. Links are in the show notes. You can find me at jeffccarter.com and hit the link to pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular.